Right. A very good evening to you all. I hope we are ready for our class. I've given
Yes, good evening, Prof.
most of you co-host rights, and I want you to help me and manage those mics that are likely to misbehave. So kindly help me so that we do not get into those interferences, right? And all right, I think let me just share this. Right, great. Can you all see my slide, that side?
Yes.
Okay. I think last time when we met, we agreed that we shall be meeting today. And the main objective is to ensure that we go through this small element of our research. I call it a small component because a proposal has so many parts, right? Of course, you know, it has about 3 major chapters or 4 in some cases, where you have the introduction, you've got the literature review, and I've seen that some people actually prefer to divide that into 2, the theoretical literature review and the empirical literature review, while others actually do mix the 2. And that's where the conceptual framework is developed, and then you articulate the methodology, right? So methodology gives you the 3rd chapter, right, or 4th chapter, depending on the structure of your university, right? So today I said, well, as we did discuss last time when we had our lecture on conjunctures and refutations, we said, well, why don't we look at this element of the research problem? How do we write the research problem? So what are those major components that we must consider when we are developing the research problem? And at the same time, I remember there's a student who asked me a question about generating a research topic from a statement of the problem. If you have crafted it, how do you do that? Right, I had anticipated that he will send me her work, or she will send me her work a little bit early, so that I go through it and I find ways of giving guidance to the class using her work, right? But she sent the work a little bit late, and I couldn't really go through it. I just saw it on the phone, right? A few minutes, or a few minutes away, right? So I may not go into that, but even then, this element of the statement of the problem is also very broad, and I do not think that we shall be able to cover this. And even then, I'll be skipping a number of things that are important, right? And yet, we probably have to cover them. Now, one of the things that you need to note is that many times we are not actually trained how to develop some of these things, and we just learn along the way. So you find somebody is grappling with the introduction. At the same time, the student is grappling with the components that constitute the introduction, which is chapter 1, right? You will be told you need to have an introduction. Within the introduction, you'll have background to the study, then the background to the study. Can somebody help us to mute the mics that are misbehaving? You will also be told. Can someone tell Rashid Intale, please mute? You'll be told that after the introduction, within the introduction, you need background to the study. Even some universities or institutions will tell you that even background, you have the historical background, you've got the theoretical background, you've got the conceptual background, you've got the contextual background. before you reach the statement of the problem, right? But we are never told exactly what we should have, right, in all those subsections. So that's why I thought we should have a scholarly approach, right, to writing the statement of the problem, right? So I start with the philosophical foundations of the research problem. And of course, as I've already said, the philosophical formulations are very, very important, because the formulation of a research problem is not really, or what we call merely, a technical exercise in identifying a gap in the literature, but rather it is fundamentally a philosophical activity that is actually rooted in the assumptions about the nature of reality, right? And when we say the nature of reality, we are talking about ontology. When we talk about the nature of knowledge, we are talking about epistemology, and also the relationship between the researcher and the phenomenon under investigation, and of course the appropriate means of generating knowledge, and that gives us methodology, right? So I think, as you can see, before a researcher formulates a research problem, right, or what I call a meaningful scholarly research problem, he or she must understand the philosophical foundations that shape what constitutes a legitimate problem that is worth investigation. And of course, this is very, very, very important, because if you lose it, then you will not be able to do a good job. So that's where we find that these issues play a major role, right? And once you understand this, then you'll be able to craft a very good statement of the problem, right? But if you do not understand, and the whole thing is artificial, right?
Who are you?
And of course, when I say artificial, sometimes people use words like mechanical, right? So if you are told that, the statement of the problem that you have come up with is mechanical, you know exactly what they are talking about. So understanding those philosophical foundations is therefore essential, because they influence the type of questions that the researcher or researchers are likely to ask. It also influences the nature, right, of evidence they consider legitimate. Because remember, a problem must be grounded in evidence, right? I'll be talking about that later on, but I'm just giving you now major, right, what I call the overview of the problem that we intend to develop for our PhD, right? So the philosophical foundations will play a major role in terms of the types of questions you will ask, the evidence that you are going to consider as legitimate as a researcher, and of course, the methods that you will generate at some stage, and the explanations, right, that you are going to provide, right, or the explanations that you will later on generate, and the contribution that you are going to make to knowledge. And I think for a very long time we've been telling you that PhD is rooted, right, in the contributions that you make to the existing body of knowledge, right? And this is very, very important, right? And of course, for some of you who have been reading widely, I sent you a book some time back that was written by Crote, 1998, right, which was actually research methods. And you may have discovered from the works of Crote that any meaningful and useful research project will rest upon the philosophical assumptions, right? Whether you as a researcher explicitly acknowledge those philosophical assumptions or you do not actually acknowledge them. And in most cases, we don't acknowledge. We are not even told, and we don't even know that actually a research problem should be rooted in the philosophical assumptions, right? And again, if you have read the works of Guber and Lincoln, 1994, I think that is a book in qualitative research. I am not very sure whether I sent you that book, right? But if I sent you that book, you may have discovered that actually Guber and Lincoln argue that the formulation of a research problem, right, is rooted, highly rooted in the assumptions of the paradigms that you are going to use that actually shape the entire research process, right from the problem formulation, right, up to the interpretation of findings. So the philosophical assumptions of research, ladies and gentlemen, are very important. They also ground the research problem. And you need to understand the problem because at the end of the day, you are going to use a lens, and that is a paradigm to explain, right, what is happening. So unless you know that there is an element of the paradigm, right, then you may not be able to come up with a very good research problem, right? And as I have been telling you, and of course, this is not it's not really new knowledge to you now, right? I did tell you that there are majorly four, right, paradigms or what you call traditions that actually influence contemporary research, right? And these paradigms, as you can see on the screen, right, you have positivism, interpretivism, critical realism, and critical theory, right? And what I'm going to do is to take you through each one of these so that you are able to tell exactly how the problem is likely to resemble in case your research, right, rests in this paradigm that we call the positivistic paradigm. Now, you all know, and I think, again, I'm just reminding you a few things that you studied, and maybe you did not pay attention to these particular things, but they are very important, that positivism generally emerged during the 19th century, if you recall, and that was primarily through the work of the French philosopher, and that French philosopher is Auguste Comte, right? And I'm sure you know that fellow very well. And he's actually the founder of positivism, right? And according to Comte, right, Comte actually argued that human knowledge, right, progresses through three major steps, right? And he provided those particular steps. And of course, if you recall, the first step which he articulates is what he calls the theological stage, right? Theology, that is from, theological is from the word theology, theological stage. And the second that he actually gives is the metaphysical stage. And actually the third that he does provide is the positive, or what we call the scientific stage. And you need to know this because you and me know very well that in many situations, when people fail to provide explanations to a number of things, they actually consult theology to offer an explanation. You all know this very well. A long time ago, before the discovery of a telephone, for example, right? People used to move distances just to communicate, right? But when they discovered the telephone, but even before the discovery, right, people used to communicate to one another through probably dreams. Someone would say, I dreamt when I'd actually visited this person and we were discussing this, and therefore this dream right, is actually correct, and they would offer interpretations of the dreams. Even today, by the way, they still provide explanations and interpretations of particular dreams. Right, but of course, in terms of visiting, they'll say, well, it has implications, but later on, people started, right, using modern methods of communication, right? But do not forget that even then, when the first person discovered this element of a phone, that you can actually stand here, right, and call someone who is very far, right? People would do call that. Can someone help me to mute those mics that are misbehaving? Right. Someone would say, well, that is actually witchcraft, right? That is spiritualism. How can you talk to someone, right, who is very far, right? People would not understand the science, right, behind those communications, right? Even the operations, right, carrying out an operation, opening somebody's tummy or brain, right, and carrying out a successful surgery, right? That wasn't an easy thing, right? You and me know that very well, right? But of course, today, right, those explanations do exist, right? But again, if we cannot explain anything, right, we say, well, you attribute, right, those particular things to theology. So theology will offer and offers actually most of the interpretations relating to certain things that we do not understand, right? And that is the nature. And that's why Comte actually comes up with this kind of thinking that knowledge actually progresses through these stages, the theological, the metaphysical, and of course the positive, and that is the scientific, right, stage, right, or what we call scientific knowledge, which is based on observation and measurement. So of course, you know that Comte lived around, I think, 1853, right, up to some time. I can't remember the date, but of course, this is the time when scientific knowledge, right, started surfacing and representing what you call the highest form of human understanding, because it is based on observation, it is based on measurement, it is based on verification, right? We don't simply make statements anyhow, right? In fact, when you go through research very, very well, you'll understand that we do not simply make statements, right, anyhow. So there must be evidence, right? So of course, later on, there are so many other scholars who joined the queue and took on, right, this element and started explaining it away, right? So you have people like John Stuart Mill, right, and that was really a philosopher, if you remember, and a political economist, right? Then you have other people, I'm sure you remember them, like Emily Durkheim, right? And he was a sociologist. He also lived, right, during this period. Then you have others like the Rudolf Carnap, right? Again, I hopefully in future I'll have an opportunity to expose to you to Carnap's, right, construction of the universe, right? And of course, we shall also see the aspects that relate to the demon, right, that he brings out, right, in his philosophical understanding, right? And you need to understand what he actually talks about. So, and he came up with what you call logical positivism, right? So if you see what comes up later on as positivism, and you have this element of logical positivism, then you know Carnap, right? Construction of the world is at play, right? And then, of course, you had other people like Karl Hampel and a number of others that also did a great job in this case. So As you can see, this is the positivist period, right? What we call positivism. And the people who took up this kind of thinking actually took up what we call the positivistic, so that everything is rooted in observation, right? And every work that is done is rooted in scientific knowledge and is rooted in measurement. So that's why we are usually very much interested in things like conceptualization, right? Operationalization, and of course, measurement. Now, of course, you know that there are also what we call the ontological assumptions that are related to positivism, where you really deal with the reality, right? Because ontology refers to the nature of reality. And of course, these people who believe in positivism has a thinking that reality exists independent of the human consciousness and, of course, perception. So whether you are aware that reality exists, right, or does not exist, it will be there anyway. So it is independent of you, the researcher. So even when your problem is rooted into this, you know that a problem, right, that has confronted society, right, or a particular community or organization exists and is there, whether you are conscious about it or unconscious about it, the problem is there, right? And that's why that problem is viewed as objective, right, and stable, right, in nature. So when we start asking you to produce evidence, right, to support the issue that you are talking about, then the work is largely rooted in what we call positivism, because we believe in objective and stable understanding of reality, and we believe in observation, we believe in measurements, and we believe in generating what we call universal laws. Or we even believe that the problem that you're going to investigate in one way or the other is governed by some universal laws. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think you can see what positivism is all about and how we can actually bring in these ontological assumptions. So when you provide the statement of the problem, we should be able to see, right, these ontological perspectives. And it doesn't matter whether you are a positivistic, right, or whether you are based in other traditions like the ones that I have presented already here, like in interpretivism or critical realism or critical theory. So it doesn't matter where you belong. We should be able to see the ontological dimensions of your statement of the problem, right? Now, that is not all. We should also be able to see the epistemological assumptions, right, or epistemological perspectives of the research problem. And of course, if you are dealing with the positivistic tradition, then we believe here that knowledge is generated or acquired through observation. Knowledge is acquired through observing the phenomenon, right, and interpreting what is taking place. But that is not sufficient. We can also carry out experiments trying to explain, right, how, right, certain interventions, right, explain, right, those particular phenomenon that we are concerned with, right? So issues of experiments, issues of measurements, issues of verification, issues of hypothesis testing, right, becomes the norm of the day. And that's why we need to think, right? So if you are using positivism, researchers at this level are expected to remain independent, right, of the phenomenon being studied. So we expect you to detach yourself from the problem because it exists, right, independent, right, of your consciousness, right, and of course here objectivity is valued very, very much. So even when you begin dealing with the issues of reducing bias, right, throughout the entire methodology, it means that you want to achieve this element of objectivity. So the ideal researcher in this case is considered to be neutral, right, and detached from the problem that you are trying to study, ladies and gentlemen. So knowledge at this level is considered to be valid when it can be empirically verified. So if we can empirically verify this knowledge, right, and then we value, right, that knowledge, and we say this knowledge is valid, and that's why we are concerned with the issues of validity and reliability, ladies and gentlemen. So that is how positivism comes in. Now, maybe what I need to do here is to demonstrate to you, right, how this positivistic thinking, right, is going to largely, right, affect, right, in the way you are going to express or even describe the problem that you intend to investigate, ladies and gentlemen. So within positivism, right, research problems, ladies and gentlemen, emerge when objective knowledge, right, objective knowledge, and don't forget, right, the selection of the words here, right? So you will only, right, have a problem, a research problem, and you'll be able to describe the problem very well when objective knowledge is incomplete. Objective knowledge is incomplete. And that is why we require you to review literature, right, to identify a gap, and that gap must be problematized, right? And I'll be talking about that later on. How do we problematize knowledge that is incomplete in literature? So when you're talking about a statement of the problem, there must be an element of knowledge, right, that has been documented about a particular phenomenon. And that knowledge, right, must in one way or the other be incomplete. And that is a positivistic thinking that is highly rooted in the critical review of literature. So under positivism, ladies and gentlemen, we value, right, knowledge and construct a research problem if and only if the knowledge that exists out there is incomplete. And here, there are about three general conditions. I don't know whether I should call them conditions or situations. I think they are situations. There are three situations, right? And I call them major situations. There are others, but the ones that I can remember off cuff, there are about three situations that generate research problems, right? And you must be aware of this. The first one is when you have a contradiction between theory and observation, right? If, for example, you know that we've got a theory, it could be resource-based theory, it could be the higher echelon theory, right? It could be institutional theory, right? You are very familiar with the theories you are working with in your area, right? I don't have to tell you what these theories are. You are more knowledgeable than me, right? Because you've been interrogating literature in that area. So if you discover that a theory exists, right? Unfortunately, the things I see, right? That is the reality now. The things I see cannot be explained, right, by this particular theory, right? So that means there will be a contradiction between theory and observation. So we are simply saying that the research problem is going to exist, ladies and gentlemen, and it will arise when empirical evidence does not support theoretical predictions, right? So if you have that element existing, then we have to think very hard. I can give you an example, right? Let's imagine that we have agency theory, right? For some of you who use, who are in the area of management, right, or accounting, right? Agency theory exists, right? But you know that agency theory, for example, predicts that monitoring mechanisms will reduce what you call managerial optimism. Not optimism, but opportunism, right? So that is what knowledge says, right? It is documented. The theory says that if, for example, you are dealing with monitoring, right? You've put monitoring in place in a particular organization, and this monitoring could be in the area of accounting, and these are financial controls, by the way. So you do some bit of monitoring there. By the way, you could use the same, right, theory in other settings as well, where monitoring mechanisms apply, right? So you know that the more you monitor, the more you are likely to reduce managerial opportunism, these opportunistic behaviors, right? Because people exhibit opportunistic behaviors. So they are likely to take advantage of the organization. And just like the way you've been hearing in Parliament, that Parliament is corrupt, right? There are so many opportunistic behaviors that have been described of recent in Parliament. So you discover that, yes, according to agency theory, right, if you have monitoring mechanisms in place, then opportunism is going to reduce. That is known. However, when you look at empirical studies, right, you discover that there is persistent opportunism, right? So evidence from empirical studies, right, somehow report that opportunism seems to be rampant or widespread, right? Despite monitoring mechanisms. So, for example, we might say in Parliament, you've been having these monitoring mechanisms. But despite the existence of these monitoring mechanisms, still there is opportunism. In an organization, right, where you put controls, this could be managerial controls, financial controls, right, they are in place. Right, in one or the other, you discover that even with these controls, opportunism is rampant. So in this case, there's a contradiction. The contradiction now becomes the research problem. The contradiction, right, between what the theory says and where these things have been, right, put in place, thinking that opportunism will reduce, but unfortunately, opportunism continues to exist. So that means that that is a contradiction that warrants an investigation. And an investigation here is in terms of research. So you generate a research problem that way. And that's why in most cases, your doctoral committee, right, or your supervisors will tell you, please go and review literature. I think someone asked a question relating to that last time when we had a class here. What did the professor mean when he said to go and read the literature, right? In other words, he wanted you to discover, right, contradictions so that these contradictions could actually form a research problem. And that is a contradiction between the theory, right, and of course, empirical evidence that exists out there. Right. The second major issue, right, that can give rise to a problem is what I call unknown relationship between the variables, right? Excuse me, there are some concepts or constructs or variables, right? But we do not understand, right, the kinds of relationship between these particular variables, right? Again, I can give you an example, right, where the relationship between variables is insufficiently understood, right? So, for example, if you review literature, right, and you discover that organizational learning, for example, influences innovation. The more organizations learn, right, the more innovations that you are likely to have in that particular organization. So that means you have two constructs here. One is organizational learning, and the second one is innovation, right? So these are two constructs, but you also observe, maybe from a review of literature, right, that yes, we know there's a link between organizational learning and innovation. People have done research and we see correlations which are very strong. You can even do a meta-analytic study if you want, or a systematic literature review, right, and get as many journal articles as possible. And this could be thousands of journal articles or even millions. And you see that there is a positive relationship, right? But you discover that studies have been conducted in different settings. That is correct. But, right, the mechanisms through which organizational learning influences, right, sustainable innovations, right, because innovations, yes, may actually crop up in these organizations, right, but these innovations are not sustainable. So whereas we know that organizational learning, right, influences innovations, but the mechanisms through which organizational learning will lead to sustainable innovations within companies or organizations is not clearly understood. So what does this mean? It means that there is a knowledge gap, right? And that knowledge gap is between these two constructs, organizational learning and innovation, right? So in other words, you go out and you craft a problem that will be based on the mechanisms. So when you see individuals coming up with the mediation variables, right, they don't simply wake up one morning and say, let me place here a mediator, right, and I see how this mediator actually influences, right, the relationship between these two variables. No, you pick this from literature so that you are able to bring this element there. Sometimes it could be a moderator. So I think you can see if two variables are insufficiently understood, if the relationship between two variables is sufficiently understood, then we do that. Now, the third, right, way, right, major way of spotting a problem could be in terms of incomplete causal explanations, right? Sometimes you have explanations that are incomplete, right? So, of course, in this case, you have an element of what we call the unobserved outcomes, right? And these unobserved outcomes will certainly require adequate explanations because there's lack of adequate explanations within these causal relationships, right? Again, I can use an example here before we go to the other philosophical orientation, which is actually the interpretivism, right? We are still dealing with the positivism, right? So since we are dealing with the incomplete causal explanations, let's use an example of SMEs. That is small and medium enterprises. I know that some of you are actually studying SMEs, right? That's what I saw last time. Now, if you're studying SMEs and you know that these SMEs actually thrive, right, despite, right, resource constraints, and there are SMEs actually that thrive, right? SMEs are there, right? And you can observe them in every sector, right? But you discover that they don't have sufficient resources, right? And you can go to any town, right, in Uganda, you discover that there are some ladies and some gentlemen running these SMEs, and these SMEs are doing very well, right? But when you look at the resources they don't have sufficient resources. Someone started operating with 100,000 shillings or even 50,000 Uganda shillings. And the fellow has been operating, right, with that amount of money for quite some time and is not closing shop. And yet you have those companies that also start with some good money. The fellow starts with 200 millions. And that business does not even celebrate, right, its third, right, birthday, right, or second birthday. So they collapse either in the first year or second year or third year. So if you observe those SMEs thriving despite severe resource constraints, right, and yet others are failing despite possession of abundant resources, right, then you may want to interrogate, right, the causal explanations, right? Why is it that these ones with small or what you call constrained resources, how come these ones with constrained resources are actually surviving while those ones with them? So you may want to seek causal factors explaining the differences, right, in this case. So this again will give you a research problem that is rooted largely in what we call positivistic thinking, ladies and gentlemen. So, of course, it's quite important for us to think about research problems being influenced with a paradigm, right, that you are undertaking. So, we can have many, many examples. How I wish you people had sent me some cases to discuss. Maybe some of these things would have come up and would have been easy for us to tell exactly what is happening, right? But I think I can give you the second, right? Um, um, okay, I can give you the second example before I go to to the second, right, interpretivism, right. But of course, before I give you a second example, right, it's important for us to again, right, know the strength and the limitations of these approaches that we are talking about, right. But before that, let me give you an example of financial literacy, and maybe I give you an example in financial literacy and inclusion, and also maybe pick another example from renewable energy and others from employee performance, right? So, for example, if you have financial literacy and financial inclusion, let's imagine that those are two variables that you want to study, right? Financial literacy and financial inclusion, right? And somehow you have reviewed literature and you have discovered that numerous studies have linked financial literacy to financial inclusion. And of course, you know that is true. But you also discover that the findings that have been documented in literature remain inconsistent, right, across developing economies. So, whereas in Uganda, right, you might have a positive kind of relationship. When you go to South Africa, right, you might get a negative relationship, or you go to Asia, you have a positive or a negative. You come to Africa, you have, or you don't even find a link, right, between those two constructs. That means that findings remain inconsistent across developing economies. So some studies actually report strong positive effects, whereas others report the weak relationships or insignificant, or what I call non-significant relationship. So that means that you're going to come up with a problem that will center around the thinking that although financial literacy is widely regarded as a critical determinant of financial inclusion, right, empirical findings remain inconsistent, right, across developing economies. Of course, this suggests the fact that the relationship may be contingent upon contextual or institutional factors that remain insufficiently understood. So that kind of framing, right, in this case, reflects what we call a positivistic concern, right? Of course, with the major objective of establishing, right, what we call the objective causal relationships, right? So in other words, your research problem is highly located in a contested area, right? And therefore you must think a lot. Let me give you another example, and then I will stop there, and then we can have a discussion, right? Let's use renewable energy adoption, right? So you may discover that, for example, countries, right, are investing a lot of resources in what we call renewable energy infrastructure, right? And you know very well that in Uganda, I think we've tried our level best in that area, right? But the adoption rates remain uneven across rural communities. And when you interrogate literature, you discover that actually existing studies also provide limited understanding of the factors that actually explain the variation in adoption behavior. So, of course, the implication here is that you are going to locate your study, right, in an area where you are going to identify measurable determinants, right? Because the investments have been done, right? Energy infrastructure exists, adoption rates have become low. And you must have evidence, by the way, right? The adoption rates within or across rural communities. And then the studies themselves do not provide sufficient understanding of the factors that explain the variations in the adoption behavior. So in such situation, you will be forced, right, to go and study that. Right, so I think I do not have to go into or give more examples because you understand exactly what we are talking about here, right? But we can really talk about the strength, right, and the limitations, right, of the positivistic paradigm in helping us to come up with a problem that can be researched, right? And I'm sure you can see the strength there on the slide, right? That, of course, at some stage, we are likely to have measurable evidence, right? So you'll be able to go out, right, and collect the data, and of course, provide the evidence, right, to either explain, right, or probably provide the causal mechanisms, right, or probably the mediation or the moderation in that case, right? So that is really the strength and, of course, an advantage of this method. The other one is that if it is rooted in a positivistic, then we can actually go and test. We can easily test hypotheses because hypothesis testing becomes the norm of the day, right? And of course, at the end of the day, you'll be able to make predictions. And that's why you find these people running regression models and telling you that, the dependent variable explains 50% of the variation. So the independent variables explain 50% of the dependent variable. So they are able to provide that explanation, right? And even when they use hierarchical regression models, that means they're running these variables in a hierarchy So they can actually provide the predictive strength at every level, right, of estimation, right? So they are able to test the hypothesis, you are able to predict, right? And of course, you will be able to generalize your findings to contexts and settings that are more or less similar to your own, right? And of course, you will be also to contribute to theory testing in this case. But of course, there are limitations as well, and that's why in research you are supposed to identify those particular limitations. All right, and these are what we call weaknesses, right, of the uh, of the of the method, right, that you are using, right. Of course, some of the things that have been presented in this case, right, relate to oversimplification of reality, right. That's reality is very complex out there and there are multiple interpretations. So how can you just simplify this into some kind of model, right? And then start testing these kinds of things. So you will neglect, right, the subjective meanings, right, that can actually be explored further into detail, right? And of course, you are going to ignore the context, you are going to ignore the culture of the people that are involved in. So as you can see, it really assumes excessive, right, objectivity, right, and yet reality is not like that. So let me pause here a little bit just to find out whether you have really understood, right, the issue that we are discussing here, right? How paradigms actually shape the research problem. Later on, I'll give you the components that we use, right, that we consider when we are crafting, so that after you've written your statement of the problem, you can always check and see whether those things are there. I'll not give you a formula that tells you that this one comes first, this one comes second. That will depend on your supervisor, but at least those particular components must be there, right? When we look at your problem, we want to see whether those issues are there or not. Right, so let me stop here, right? Of course, aware of the fact that we've been dealing with positivistic thinking and how it actually influences what we are doing before we go to our second aspect that we call interpretivism, right? I know that some of you are using interpretivist philosophical paradigm, right? Right, so who will go first? I open up the discussion. Just put up your hand and speak. Hello, are you there?
We are there, doctor.
Okay. Any comment?
Yes, we are there.
Okay, fine. You can go ahead and speak. Of course, we shall reach where you want me to be. I know each one of you is very eager. He wants to see the components that constitute the problem. Today, we shall discuss those aspects, but I thought I should expose you to the philosophical perspectives and how the problem speaks to philosophy or how philosophy speaks to the problem. So that when we tell you that your problem statement must have philosophical orientations, you don't begin questioning and you say, this one is wrong, this one is right. Right? Any comment? Hey, everybody is very quiet. Vianney. Israel, let me see. This is Edgar.
Good evening, Prof.
Good evening, how are you?
I'm okay, Prof.
Yes,
Prof,
sir.
thank you for that presentation. It is actually touching. Prof, I want to find out whether it is possible that I may take both interpretivism and positivism at the same time in my work.
Right. I think we shall answer that question after covering interpretivism, right? Because you might be asking about interpretivism when people do not even understand what it is, right? So we want to see, and that's where we are moving. That's where we are going in the next few minutes. We want to see what interpretivism is all about. Maybe we don't even have to worry about the third philosophical orientation. At least I should be able to show you, right, and give an example of these things. And I'm sure after going through the interpretivism and giving examples, you yourself you should be able to tell whether you can mix these two and have a problem that resides in positivistic and interpretivist perspective. So you need to understand that very well. And these are traditions, by the way, don't forget, when we talk about paradigms, we are talking about traditions, right? And of course, they have proponents. Every tradition has a proponent, right? There are those who strongly believe in positivistic, and they have nothing to do with interpretivist. There are those with interpretivist, and they have nothing to do with positivistic. Maybe at this moment, let me introduce the second one so that.
Prof, can I ask a question?
Please go ahead.
So what is the difference between positivism and logical positivism?
Okay, so you want me to go into logical positivism, right? Why don't we do this? Can you just say that question, right? Because that is the post-positivistic paradigm. It comes thereafter, and that's where people like Karl Popper exists, right? I'm sure went through conjunctures and refutations. So can you keep it and we discuss it towards the end, right? So that now we first handle the issue of the problem, right? We need to bring this to a conclusion so that we know how we can actually craft, right? I've just given you examples on how you can pick the problem from literature and you also relate that to what exists out there, like the example of the adoption rate, right, of clean energy, right, versus what, the investments that government has made. And yet when you go through literature, we don't have, right, explanations in terms of the adoption, the differences in the adoption behavior. You find one community adopts, the other community does not adopt. So we want to see what is happening. Fred, does that make sense? If I said you keep it and then you ask it towards the end, is that okay? The same to my friend there that was in Tali Rashid, right? As to whether you can actually locate your problem in two paradigms, right? So for me, I might forget, right? But for you, please do not forget, write it at the side so that we deal with it. So when we talk about interpretivism, again, I'll give you the summary, right, of this. Otherwise, we need also a full lecture on interpretivism, right? But for some of you who've been attending our lectures, I did talk about these traditions, right, the other week at Makerere. So, of course, you know that the contributors are actually those fellows that I've given you. Dilthey, I think it's called Wilhelm Dilthey, and this was a German philosopher. Max Weber, you all know Max Weber very well, and some of you who deal with the institutional theory by Max Weber, who brings in the element of hierarchies and so forth. So he was largely a sociologist. Incidentally, you can identify and study a problem at the organizational level, but root it in what we call organizational sociology, right? So it is possible, and that's why you need to understand all these things so that whereas someone might come with finance kind of explanations or background, right? He does not overshadow the other fellow who is using a sociological perspective in analyzing what's happening in organizations. So you have individuals, and therefore the sociology of organization is very important. And by the way, there's a whole course, right? And many books have been published on the sociology of organizations. So I want to invite you to read, right, the sociology of organizations, especially if you want to locate your study in that particular area, right? So the other person is Shoes. I think today you had someone who made a presentation at 5 a.m., between 5 and 6. And he was actually oscillating between these fellows here. He was talking about Shoes, he was talking about Gadama, he was talking about so many other fellows, right? But of course, with the Shoes, the element of phenomenology becomes very important, right? And I'm sure you heard that gentleman talking about phenomenological philosophical orientation, right? So his study, if you recall, when he was making a presentation early this morning, right, he was locating his study in a phenomenological perspective. But I think he was a little bit confused because he was all over the place. At the same time, he was talking about John, Hans, and Gadama. And there he was largely talking about hermeneutic, right, philosophy. And combining these two, right, as you heard me say this morning, is very problematic because the fellow was unable to tell us at what stage. First of all, when you listen to the statement of the problem, it does not bring out these aspects of phenomenology and hermeneutics, right? And at the same time, when you look at the methodologies, right, adopted, right, again, they did not, they were very silent, right, about this particular aspect. And even the traditions, right, the philosophical traditions were very silent about these particular aspects. So as you can see, all these become very critical and very important, right? And of course, if you take this view of interpretivism, ladies and gentlemen, you will discover that the proponents of this paradigm or philosophical paradigm, right, actually believe that human beings are likely to differ, right, fundamentally, and there's a fundamental difference between human beings in this element. In as far as physical objects are concerned. So you cannot, for example, connect, right, the relationship between the individual and the objects, right, that exist out there. And of course, here the element that comes in that you need to think about is the reality, right? I've been talking about the ontological assumptions that you make. Reality out there, right? And we saw under positivism, if you recall, that reality exists independent, right, of the researcher, independent of the researcher. So whether, right, you are conscious about a particular problem existing out there or not, right, reality will manifest itself. So that was positivism, if you remember, right? But now the interpretivist certainly argue that human beings differ fundamentally from physical objects because they create meanings, right? So meanings become very key, and it is individuals who create those particular meanings, right? And also interpret the experiences that they have gone through. As you heard from that gentleman who was talking about the use of ICT in agriculture, right? So in other words, human beings are not robots, they're not machines that you simply say that you're going to detach yourself from the problem. And when you detach yourself from the problem, right, you're going to be as objective as you can be, right? And you'll be talking about objective validation or validity, right? So in other words, you design tools and methods. You go and collect the data. You reduce bias in the entire process, right? And then come up with findings. That is the positivistic. Now, interpretivist, that is not so. We are not robots, we are not machines, we are not physical objects. So we differ, right, fundamentally from physical objects, because for us, we have the experiences that we've gone through. And even when we are interpreting situations and realities out there, we factor in our experiences. And that's where these fellows who undertake qualitative research using reflexivity actually pick their inspiration from, right? So reflexivity is taken to be a key issue and an important point, right, at this material time. And all those ideas were certainly propounded by Dilthey, by Weber, by Hughes, and Gadama, right? And I think for those who were with us this morning, right, you did hear what the students said. So of course, social science in this case, right, will focus on understanding, right, the reality out there, rather than just offering mere explanation of the reality out there. So what happens in this case, there are what we call the ontological assumptions of interpretivism. We saw the ones for positivism, but under interpretivism, the number of things that we consider. Of course, the major assumption here that reality is socially constructed. So we deal with the social construction of reality, right? Now, of course, the other aspect that is very important at this time, right, is that reality is multiple. In other words, there are multiple interpretations, right, of reality, right? So you don't have a single reality, but you have multiple realities. And if you recall in my earlier lectures on philosophy of methods, if you recall, I gave an example of an accident occurring, right, at a certain point or certain location, right, that you can call L1, right, or LA, right? So you have an accident occurring. Now you bring a number of people with a number of different paradigms. So you'll discover that the explanations that they will provide will vary, right? Someone who has a philosophical orientation will provide a philosophical explanation of that reality. Someone from, for example, traffic, right? Maybe works with the police and is from the traffic police department. Again, will try to use his knowledge, right? A psychologist will also offer an explanation of the cause of the accident. He will say, yes, the young man, right, who was knocked down by a car, a young lady was knocked down by a car, right? This happened because maybe he had a terrible relationship, right, a week before or earlier, right? And this created some bit of trauma, right? And he could not reconcile these things. So as he was moving around, so he was actually knocked down, right? Because he was deeply stressed, right? And taken up. And that would be an explanation that is offered by that person who has a psychological background. So if you go into interpretivism, the assumption here is that reality, right, as we view it, is multiple in nature, right? And of course, again, that element of multiple reality brings in subjectivity as well. Whereas the explanations are multiple, right, and reality exists in multiple ways or a number of ways, so we can still offer subjective explanations, right? But even then, that reality is socially constructed, as I did say earlier on, and is socially negotiated, and it is context dependent, right? So meaning that different individuals, right, may experience the same event differently and may also offer differing explanations. So in other words, there is no single objective reality in this case, And instead, there are multiple realities, and the multiple realities here must be taken into consideration, ladies and gentlemen. So that is the ontological perspective of the interpretivism philosophical orientation or a paradigm in this case, right? So, but again, having looked at the ontological perspectives, right? As I did say earlier on, every paradigm, every lens that you use, every tradition that you use to explain reality out there, right, has the ontological perspective, it has the epistemological perspective, and it also has a theological, right, perspective. So in other words, when we take the epistemological, right, concept in this case, or perspective as we see it, the assumption here is that, yes, we are interested in creating knowledge, as I did indicate. At your level, we don't expect you to be net consumers of knowledge, but you are supposed to be creators of knowledge. So the industry you are joining, ladies and gentlemen, requires you to create knowledge, but you cannot create knowledge without knowing what exists out there. And that's why you must review volumes and volumes of published research work, right? And once you review, you'll be able to critique and identify a gap that you are going to problematize, as we saw. And I'll be teaching you again later on how to problematize literature so that you generate, right, a credible research problem, right, that you are going to state, right, and people will not begin asking questions as to what you are doing. So problematizing literature is very, very important, right? And we pick that from scholarly literature. And that is why your supervisors or your doctoral committee will actually emphasize that you need recent literature, right? And the period that is actually prescribed in most scholarly works, right, and empirical works is about 2 to 3 years, right? Of course, there are those who will extend and say, well, you can review literature that was published 5 years ago, right? But the idea here is that the problem that you're investigating must be recent. So recency of the problem matters a lot. You cannot base a research problem on a study that was conducted in 2023 when we are in 2026. Maybe that problem no longer exists, right? And it has been resolved. And that's why you must have a practical problem, right? And you must have either a theoretical problem or an empirical problem, right? But all of that, whether it is empirical, whether it is methodological, whether it is, I mean, as long as it is rooted in literature, right? You must do a thorough review of literature. So you must be immersed in literature and identify those particular gaps that you are going to problematize, right? Again, I'll give you methods of problematizing literature, and they're largely about 3 methods that I'll be talking about later on and not necessarily now. But I think the idea now is for you to know that a problem emerges, right, from research that has been published or from a theory that has been constructed over time, which you must actually interrogate critically, and then again relate that to the existing reality out there, right? So in other words, knowledge is actually socially constructed, as I said, but it is co-created through what we call interaction and interpretation. So the experience of the researcher in this case means a lot, right? So knowledge will emerge through interaction between the researchers and the participants. That's why you have the social construction element coming in there. So researchers in this case seek to understand rather than prediction. So our objective here is not to come up with the predictive potentials so that the independent constructs predict 50%, right, of the criterion variable, right? So that is not done because that is not our objective, ladies and gentlemen. And once you understand that, then you'll be able to do a good job, right? So our interest under interpretivism, right, is really meanings. We want to get experiences. We want to get meanings. We want to get perceptions. We want the lived realities, right? And of course, the narratives that we pick from the respondents out there. So this interaction is very important, and that's why we talk about co-creation of knowledge through interaction and interpretation, ladies and gentlemen. So how does this then, ladies and gentlemen, affect the way we conceptualize research problems? Remember, this is now interpretivism. So how does interpretivism affect the way we conceptualize our research problem? So, of course, as I said earlier on, right, research problems arise when the experiences we have as human beings remain insufficiently understood. And of course, the concern here is not how much, right, do we know, or how much do we want to generate, but rather, what does this mean? And that's why researchers who take the interpretivism philosophical paradigm will not have really the variables that these fellows have under positivism, where you must look at the topic and then you say, well, I can see the criterion variable. I can also see the independent variables. I can also see the mediating variables. I can see the moderating variables. And that's why you must be very careful before you start commenting on other people's research and dismissing their research as invalid, not as good, that you need to understand the paradigm, right, where the fellow is coming from, so that you appreciate how the individual is going to construct knowledge, right? And I'm saying this, right, with the humility, because I've had, and I always listen, especially to novice researchers like yourselves. When some PhD students actually make presentations at some stage, you say, I listened to this person's research. It was very, very bad. Right, and that, well, the quality of work wasn't very good. You even begin castigating the doctoral committee, right? And he said, hey, even this renowned professor was behind this kind of work that the student produced. Why it's rubbish, right? It's because for you, you come from the positivistic thinking, where you deal with the predictions most of the time, and you do not understand the interpretivism philosophical orientations of paradigm. So you need to be very careful, otherwise you may end up exposing your ignorance. And when you expose ignorance, I can assure you it will be terrible. People will look at you and they say, this fellow here is a fool, right? Right, and you don't want to be called such names, ladies and gentlemen. So with the interpretivism philosophical orientation, right, the concern is, what does this mean, right? And you'll be asking yourself, how is this experienced, for example? Can someone help me to mute that person, right? So research problems, in this case, ladies and gentlemen, emerge, right, when the researchers find themselves in positions where they lack insight, right, into a number of things, like, for example, social meanings, right? They lack, for example, interpretations. They lack cultural understandings, and they also lack lived experiences, right? So then they will come up with a study of that nature, right? So let me use the example, right? Zoom user, can you help us and mute, please? Can someone help me to mute that person, right? So let me use an example that a student presented this morning, something that will border, right? I can craft an example bordering what a student presented. The student was in the area of agriculture. For some of you who attended the early morning presentation, right? And the student was actually talking about digital, right, agriculture, really, right? So in other words, governments may increase, right? And this is the case we are taking. right, you discover that governments, like now the government of Zambia, the fellow was talking about Zambia, right, increasingly promote digital agricultural technologies. Right, but you discover that little is known about how farmers experience these technologies. And this is what actually the student was talking about. So in other words, when you are formulating the research problem, you are able to indicate that although digital agriculture technologies are increasingly promoted, right, as probably instruments for agricultural transformation, there is limited understanding, right, or limited understanding exists regarding how smallholder farmers interpret, experience, and integrate these technologies into their everyday farming practices. So your topic will be crafted around digital agriculture, right, in this case, right, or digital agriculture technologies. I think that would be the right wording in this case. So if somebody talks about a phenomenological study of digital agriculture technologies, don't say, where is your independent variable? Where is your dependent variable? Where are the moderating variables? Where are the mediating variables? It means you have not understood, right? And that's why you should always listen to what the fellow is presenting, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, I think this is very important because if you were a positivist a student, right, you'll be talking about variables, right, right. But we can, by the way, we can take another example, right, of students completing their PhD studies, right, and that can be a good example, right. A positivistic, for example, if you are positivistic, and you are a positivistic researcher, you may ask, what factors predict doctoral completion? Right. But the interpretivist researcher will not ask the same question. He will be concerned with a question of how do doctoral candidates experience and make sense of the PhD journey? Because the PhD journey is punctuated, right, by stages, right? And like many of you went through the, I think there was a concept stage, the mission stage. Now you are undergoing classes. This part of the PhD journey. Then you're also writing proposals. Then you'll be required to defend your proposals. And then you'll be allowed to pilot your instrument or go out. For some of you are going to carry out experiments. You can also have pilot tests for your experiments, but you need to be very, very careful so that you do not actually bring in an element of contamination into your experiments, right? But you can see the interpretivist fellow looks at doctoral candidates' experience, right? And will be interested in how the PhD students make sense, right, of the PhD journey. So in other words, the research problem then, right, can sound like, despite growing literature on doctoral completion rates, right, that means you would have reviewed it and you know what is there, right? So despite growing literature on doctoral completion rates, limited understanding exists regarding how doctoral candidates navigate the emotional, intellectual, social, and professional challenges that are associated with the doctoral study. So that will be now the interpretivist perspective, right? So you can actually have two doctoral candidates, right, that take a topic that is more or less similar, but have different research problems depending on the paradigm that they use, right? And that's why sometimes for me, I laugh at students who hide their work, thinking that the other students will copy. I can assure you no student can copy your work, right? Right. So if you're very innovative and creative, no one will, because you cannot have a mind that is duplicated unless you pick your work and intentionally give it to the other fellow so that the fellow starts copying. It is not possible, right, for them to start copying, right? So Again, there are many other examples. For some of you who are in procurement, for example, you can take an example of public procurement reforms, and you come up with a topic, for example, a research problem like, while procurement reforms have been extensively implemented, little is known, right, about how procurement officers experience and interpret the implementation of these reforms within public institutions, right? So you can actually improve this problem. Later on, I'll tell you the component, because this one does not have the various components of the research problem, but somehow you can see a problem emerging, right? And that is a foundation upon which you can actually write your research problem. I think Intale now can give us can give us the answer to his particular question as to whether you can actually locate your study in these two areas. Right, but of course there are other issues that we need to understand, and these are the perspectives that constitute the interpretivist research problems, right? Or research problems. So of course, yeah, in interpretivism, you always capture the rich experiences of researchers. You can also pick contextual perspectives. You can also get deep understanding, and you can also generate new insights in this case. But of course, there are limitations as well, because the interpretivist studies actually face criticism regarding those issues of generalization, right? I'm sure for some of you who listened to the student this morning, you may have had the student talking about those particular aspects of generalization and subjectivity and replicability. So you cannot replicate the same study in an environment that is more or less but for some, for just to answer the question that Intale posed at some stage, yes, when you listen to researchers who purport that, we want to take a mixed method approach, right, that fellow is more or less moving within those two traditions, the positivistic traditions and the interpretivist traditions. So, of course, you can mix the two, but that means that you are going to come up with a research problem that is more sophisticated, because you are combining two traditions that some people believe that they are opposed to each other. So you're moving from two opposite ends or continuum, and moving within that area, so that you establish the midpoint. So you can imagine, if the other fellow is at negative 100, another fellow is at a positive 100, so you must move, right, so that you come closer, and maybe you get to the midpoint somewhere there, where you begin talking about mixing maybe 50-50, qual 50 quant, right, and things like that, right, and that is very, very common, ladies and gentlemen. So that is the interpretivist perspective, right, and that is how it is done, and you can actually mix the two. So maybe what I'm going to do, let me pause, ladies and gentlemen, for about 5 minutes, but we shall also take a break for 10 minutes before we pick critical realist perspective, and then later on try to see how we can actually craft these particular research problems. Right, so over to you, ladies and gentlemen. Is there anyone that would like to come in? And if you have a question, I'm aware of the question that was raised by Fred. That's the logical. I think the one for Ntalia has been answered. We have an unanswered problem by Fred, right? So Fred, I hope you wrote your question down, and we shall deal with it. Okay, let me open the floor. I'll give you 3, 4, 5
Yes, Prof.
For your questions, and then
once again.
Thereafter, we shall rest for 10 minutes. Yes, please go ahead.
Prof, again bothered with the mixed method, in the sense that I'm wondering whether I still use the same sum frame that is for the qual and the quant.
I think the question you're asking is
Hello.
the problem you are asking. Sorry, the first
No,
one you are asking is outside.
Yes, Prof.
Is outside what we are discussing now. Can you reserve that question for a later?
I'm looking at it.
Please go on.
Okay, Prof. Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, because you are talking now. We're talking about now. You are talking
No,
about.
let me reserve the question.
You are dealing with the sampling, and we are not dealing.
My concern is that, Prof, my concern is that do I still use the same population?
The same what?
For to bring out the two idea, the same population. If I'm to use positivistic and the interpretivism.
Of course.
Do I have to again look for another population? I can deal with the same population.
It is the same population because your results must relate to the same population that you are studying. You cannot study two different populations. The moment you start dealing with the two different populations, then your study is no longer the same. You have two complete studies, two different studies, completely different, two completely different studies. So, for example, if you are studying ladies who seek right maternal care in a hospital, right, and now you of course that's a population, right, of those ladies that go for maternal right care, right, that's a population. Now if you bring in the young ones now, right, that means you are entering into pediatrics, right, area. So this problem you are researching, whereas the topic might be the same, you are dealing with the two different populations, right? So you must always have the same population for quant and qual as well. But this is not what we are discussing today. We are discussing the research problem. But nonetheless, I think you can reserve the question and later on we can deal with the problem and handle it. Another comment before we rest? Another comment?
Yes, Prof.
Yes, Andrew. Is it Andrew?
Yes. Andrew Mompenje, Prof.
Yes, please. Go ahead, Andrew.
Prof, I just wanted the clarity whether interpretivism and constructivism mean the same thing or there is a difference.
Actually, it's one of the things that we are going to handle. Again, just write it down. Your question is more or less similar to what Ntale asked, right? Because we had not gone through interpretivism, and he was wondering whether positivism and interpretivism more or less refer or can apply at the same time. So I think let's wait for constructivism, right? But again, in simple terms, before I get into the detailed explanations of that perspective, that even in interpretivism, we've got the social construction of reality, right? So there is that element of construction as well, but I think we shall try to see where these two overlap and where the differences are. Right, another comment, ladies and gentlemen. Alum, Colette, Alum, Alice.
Yes, please. Professor.
Yes. Go ahead.
I don't have any comment. As for now, I don't know whether I put my hand up, but I don't have any comments.
Fantastic. Any other question? Any other person with a burning question?
Good evening, and colleagues.
Good evening, Mubarak.
Yes, mine is simply seeking for clarification. We've been discussing interpretivism, and then phenomenological orientation. And I got confused.
Okay. I know where the confusion is coming from, right? Because what I did under interpretivism, I gave you many researchers who have contributed in that area, right? Many scholars under interpretivism, right? Especially at a point when I was giving you the historical origins of interpretivism, right? I gave you, for example, Dilthe, right? And that was it was on the slide that I have just pulled down from the platform, right? And that was he was a German philosopher, right? Then I gave you Max Weber, who was a sociologist, and Alfred Schutz, right? Just like the student this morning was presenting, and that's from phenomenology, and Hans Gadamer, and that was hermeneutic, right? Philosophy. And all those, right, gave rise to what we call interpretivism. So there's a possibility that you can easily confuse, right, phenomenology and the hermeneutic, right, or I mean with the interpretivism at the global level, right? Because even within interpretivism, you've got various, variations of philosophical orientations. So I did not go into depth, right, to tell you exactly what is contained in that area. That's where the confusion is coming from. But you can also note down, right, that question so that at a later stage, we go into the variations of these, right, philosophical orientations under these paradigms. Remember, we are dealing with paradigms, but there are philosophical orientations within these paradigms. Paradigms are traditions, right, and they are associated with certain philosophical orientations, right? And of course, when we talk about philosophy, we are talking about the reality being explained. What is the nature of reality out there? Is it subjective? Is it objective? And how do we construct knowledge? And how do we know that we have actually constructed the right knowledge? Or how do we know that we know? Right. Those are philosophical questions that we must ask ourselves. Right. So what I'll do, just write that question so that later on we can go into those areas. I did not actually imagine that you will ask those questions because my focus, right, was on the statement of the problem. So how do we use these traditions to generate? But if you want us to go into deeper philosophical orientations, I have no problem with that, right? We can even do it right away, right? But we would have lost focus on what we wanted to cover. Right, any other comment? Or we ask questions when we come back from break. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending, and I'm giving you 10 minutes break. It's now 5:44. I expect us to be back at 5:54, right, to resume our session to try and understand this element. Right, so enjoy your break. You can have a virtual tea or a virtual meal or some virtual association somehow. You can unmute and talk to each other and share stories and experiences of what you are going through. You never know, you might find a way of advising each other, right? So enjoy your break. Bye for now. We resume at 5:54.
Thank you, Prof.
Chao tamba kana mubikira okulanji baitu. Mba tukubekere. Mba tukubekera. Anzala seka kuvuga. ngabunde bakakwame ambe bamatsumba bundu walya mungawola enangesa machide niyo tukandria muna
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back from your break. I think I should not really make you stay for a very long time. I can see that many people have dropped off, right? Maybe it's because of the break. Maybe, I'm not very sure whether the break was very long, right? And I think there are a few questions here. I think who is asking, is it Modoi or let me see, I've just seen something popping up a few minutes ago. Is that Modoi or? All right. So maybe I start by answering that question, and then thereafter continue, right? But certainly the time will not be enough for us to go through some of these questions, because I can even see there's a question by Percy. What philosophical paradigm speaks to a multi-method quantitative study design? Right, now for me, the answer will depend on what you mean by multi-method quantitative study design. Right, because if, for example, by the way, I'm just assuming, I don't know whether this is what you had in mind. If by multi-method quantitative design, you mean using multiple quantitative techniques, right? Multiple quantitative, because it's also possible. I think this is an issue that my colleague Okech raised the other day at Makerere, right? Within a single paradigm, you can also have a number, right? Or within a perspective, you can have multi methods. For example, you can have surveys, you can have experiments, you can have secondary data analysis, you can have structure equation modeling, You can have multi-level modeling, etc. So if multi-level means that, right, and you want to investigate relationship among variables, then the philosophical foundation is usually positivism or post-positivism. If that is what your multi-method actually means, right? Of course, the assumption here is that reality exists independent of the researcher, and those are the things we have been talking about. Variables can be measured objectively. You can go through the conceptualization, operationalization, and measurements. Relationship can be tested empirically, all of those things, right? And even findings can be generalized. So if that's what you mean, then that's it, right? Then for positivism position, right? Of course, you will discover that most of the studies that we undertake these days actually lie within positivism rather than pure positivism. And of course, here you recognize the fact that measurement is imperfect, right? So you cannot have positive, not positive, but perfect measurement of variables, and that knowledge that you obtain is provisional. It is tentative, right? And that is what Karl Popper actually says. So you're operating within the post-positivism, right? So the findings that you have are rather, they're actually probabilistic, right? Rather than absolute. So you don't have absolute answers. And of course, meaning that you can never fully eliminate bias. So in such situations, then you will be described as positivist, right, in this case. So I think, again, you need to tell us exactly what you mean by multi, right, multi-methods, right? So, for example, if we take another thinking now, another perspective, that you want to combine multiple quantitative methods, right? Like the ones I've articulated earlier, but you want to seek, you want to explain, you are seeking explanations underlying the causal mechanisms rather than merely statistical associations. Then, of course, you are going to use critical realism. So critical realism becomes the most appropriate. So, and of course, that is very, very common, right? If you are in the area of governance, right, and you are dealing with sustainability, and you are saying governance quality predicts project sustainability, right? It could be sustainability of something else, right? So, a critical realist then would ask a question: what governance quality produce these outcomes, right? And he will pick all those, right? The governance quality perspectives. But then the gentleman is also interested, or the lady, right, is interested in the hidden mechanisms that generate this relationship. So of course, in this case, the researcher will use what we call mixed method, right? And maybe sometimes what we call explanatory studies may come in here, right? So these are things that are very important at this level, right? So in this case, something I should let you know, ladies and gentlemen, that the choice of the paradigm is not determined by the method, and it do not reduce our discussion to that level, right? That you're going to choose a paradigm based on the method. You don't start with a method and choose a paradigm. You choose a paradigm. It is a paradigm that will give you the method. First of all, the paradigm will give you the philosophical orientation, right? So you have a tradition, then the philosopher, right, will come in there. That is, you must describe the ontological perspectives, the epistemological perspectives, the axiological perspectives, etc. Then that philosophy will give you, right, of course, that ontology, right, will give you the epistemology, right, how you are going to craft, right, knowledge and how you're going to perceive knowledge. And then that will also determine the axiology, and then will determine the methodology. And within the methodology, you have the research design and a few other things. And then it will also determine the methods. So the methods are embedded within the methodology. The methodology is determined by the ontological and epistemological perspectives. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is very important. The choice of the paradigm is not determined by the method, right? Rather, it is determined by the ontology, that is the view of reality, the epistemology, that is the view of knowledge, and the purpose of inquiry. So the same survey, for example, can be used within positivism, post-positivism, and critical realism, of course, depending on the researcher's philosophical assumptions, and that is very, very important. Right, but of course, there are many other things that I have seen, right, that there are questions within the chat room here. I can see, it is Mbabulima who says, I think it must be interpretivism. We have to go and read. Then Musa Modoi, positivism is primarily related to quantitative methods, right? For Musa, right, well, of course, is broadly correct, right, that traditionally positivism is commonly associated with the quantitative methods, right? That's the deductive reasoning, hypothesis testing, measurements, and statistical analysis. While the interpretivism is commonly associated with the qualitative methods. Those are the inductive reasoning, meanings, experiences, perceptions, and so forth, right? But I must say at this level that it's important for you as PhD students to appreciate that philosophical paradigms are not determined by methods alone. So they are primarily defined by the ontological and epistemological assumptions, and that is very important. For the other friend, what is the question now? Right. Okay, I think the question gets into the other one, right? Okay, I think that's it. That is very important, and there are so many other things that you must consider, right, in dealing with the problem. Right, allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to share the slides. Where the slides, that is L1, that is where we were, right? Is that right? Yes, is that the slides that we were discussing? Right. Are you seeing my slides that side?
Yes.
Yes, Prof. We are able to see.
Okay.
Yes, we can see a slide.
Okay, I think we are moving to the third. Again, philosophical paradigm, right? And that is a critical realism, right? I think you heard me when I was giving explanations or answers to the question or questions that were raised by the students in Babuli May and another person there, right? The issue of critical realism came in there, right? Now, this critical realism or critical realist perspective or paradigm will also determine the way the problem has to be formulated, right? But before I tell you exactly how it does, how it shapes the problem, you need to know the people behind, right, this, right, or the person who is largely behind this. Again, if you remind me, I'll send you books written by Roy Basker, and Roy Basker is the person behind the critical realism, right? And of course, he's the founder. He's a founder of that philosophical paradigm, right, or orientation, right? Basker has written numerous books, right, that I'll be sharing with you, ladies and gentlemen. And he started his work in 1978, And for some of you who have had an opportunity to read his work that dates back in 1978, you may have seen what he started with and how he developed this philosophical paradigm, right? So, of course, his objective was to try and reconcile the positive aspects, right, of positivism, right, and interpretivism, right. And of course, his argument was that reality exists independent of human perception, and whether you are a positivistic or interpretivistic person, right, the reality will be there. So it doesn't matter whether you identify yourself with the positivism or interpretivism, reality is there and it will exist independent of the researcher. So he now comes up with the perspective that understanding reality, that particular reality, remains imperfect, right? Understanding it is not very easy, right? Whether you're a positivistic person, right? Understanding that reality is complex, right? And the other person who is also an interpretivist will also face the same kind of challenge. So our understanding of reality remains imperfect and socially conditioned. So in other words, his objective was to try and reconcile the positivistic because he saw that these were cutting across the two traditions, right? So it doesn't matter where you are, right? It doesn't matter at which side of the fence you are seated, right? You are confronted with the same kind of realities, only that you do not agree on a few things here and there. And therefore, he came up with what we call orientations, right? Or what we call assumptions. And these are the ontological or assumptions, right? Let me see if I have them here. I don't seem to, okay, have those particular assumptions, right? Oh, yes, they are here, right? So, of course, the domains, or what we call the assumptions of critical realism, will include empirical domain, right? That's the empirical domain, and this is what people experience, right? So it doesn't matter where you are, there is that empirical domain, you experience, right? What you interpret that reality to be constituted. First of all, what it is and how it is constituted, right? And of course, that is the empirical domain. That is what people experience. Now, the second element that Roy Basker brings out is the actual, right? The actual domain, right? Now, these are events that occur, whether they are observed, they are not observed, these events will be there, right? That's the second pillar or domain that constitute critical realism, right? So the events will unfold, right? Whether you bother, right, about the existence, right, of these domains or not, or the problem or not, right? And of course, that is the actual domain. Now, the third one is what you call the real. Now, the actual is different from the real. The actual is what occurs, whether it is observed or not observed, it will be there. It is actual, right? But the real domain now, right, is what is constituted by the causal mechanisms, right? The causal mechanisms that generate what we call observable events. So there are those issues within there that will cause, right, that kind of event, right, to manifest. And those are the underlying causal mechanisms, and those are the real domains, right? So according to Bhaskar, these three will exist: the empirical, right? That is what people experience; the actual, and that is events that occur, whether they are being observed or not; and the third one is the real domain, right? And that is the underlying causal mechanisms that actually generate those observable events. And these are very important for us to try and unearth. So for you to simply go to literature and just pick, right, variables, package them in some kind of conceptual model, and right, Bhaskar does not believe very much in that, because there are those real causal mechanisms, and that's why he actually talks about critical realism, right? Again, you'll find that you have to mix, right, the methods, but I'll be talking about this later on, not now. So those are the ontological domains that constitute, and according to Bhaskar, the real domain, right, is central and very, very important, and we must understand that very well. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to take you through epistemological domains or perspectives, right, or assumptions of critical realism in this case, right? Of course, if we take the epistemological perspective, there's a general thinking that reality cannot be fully understood, right? Whether you are using the positivistic perspective or paradigm, you will never fully understand reality. Or if you take the interpretivism perspective, you still not be able to fully understand and fully know reality and come up with objective knowledge, right? So it's very difficult. And that's why Bhaskar then recommends that through systematic inquiry, right, we can somehow come to an approximate understanding of the underlying mechanisms that generate those observable outcomes. And that's why we are talking about the real domains, because this is central. So in other words, our concern in this case is the approximation, right, of our understanding of that reality, right, by examining the hidden mechanisms, right, and these are very important. So that's what Bhaskar certainly brings out, but of course it is unfair for us to summarize critical realism, where Bhaskar spent years and years and produced books and books that we read, just to summarize it on just 1 or 2 slides. It is unrealistic. And I know many questions are likely to again emerge around this area. So if you want us to get into that, we can still have another time. Our objective here is to try and understand the problem, how we can construct the problem, and how we can conceptualize the problem from a critical realist perspective. So how do problems then emerge through critical realism, ladies and gentlemen, right? Of course, the problems will emerge when we can easily have what we call observable patterns. So if observable patterns about a particular problem somehow exist, so we can see a pattern, right, of events unfolding, right, and somehow we can pick them, right? These patterns exist, then we can craft a problem, right, and center it around the critical realist perspective. So when you are crafting the research problem, you need to be mindful about this pattern. Otherwise, if we don't see the pattern, do not begin telling us that, you know, I used the critical realist philosophical orientation, right? Now, the other aspect is if the causal mechanisms cannot be pinpointed, in other words, they remain hidden, then of course you have to use critical realism, right? Because the underlying mechanisms, yes, we want to understand it, but these remain, right, hidden, and we cannot bring them to the fore quite easily, right? So what does this mean, ladies and gentlemen? It means that the key question you are going to ask yourself, ladies and gentlemen, is not what causes this phenomenon. You are not going to ask that question, what causes this phenomenon? Because we are interested in the hidden, right, mechanism which cannot be captured. But somehow we can see patterns emerging, right? So in other words, we ask ourselves, what does this phenomenon mean? What does this pattern actually mean, right, to us? Or we begin asking ourselves, what variables predict this phenomenon? And that's why I had asked Ruth, I think, one who raised this question in our lecture. He says, how can I generate a topic from a research problem? And I said, well, why don't you give us your problem so that we generate the topic, right? The idea here was to take you through mind mapping, right? And then show you that when you move from mind mapping, you go into conceptual mapping, right? And once you go through conceptual mapping very well, then you'll be able to come up with some kind of model that you can actually use. So those are the questions that we ask, right, under critical realism, right? What does this phenomenon mean? Or what variables predict this phenomenon, ladies and gentlemen? Again, allow me to use two examples here, and I'll pause a little bit. The example I'm going to use is renewable energy adoption. I could use also corruption. We could use also student performance, right? And then I'll talk about reproduction. I know someone did ask that question some time back, right? Because it's very, very important, right? We talk about reproduction, right? We talk about reflexivity, we talk about, right, other approaches. Right, so let's imagine that the issue we are concerned with is the issue of renewable energy adoption, right? So we discover that we've got communities around us. Like in my case, you have a community this side, I have a community in front of me, I have a community this other side, I have a community behind me. So we may discover that these communities, right, actually possess similar economic characteristics, right? So if you observe the economic characteristics, they are more or less the same, right? But you discover that despite these, right, common characteristics, the renewable energy adoption rates differ substantially, right? In one community, this is what's happening. In another community, this is what's happening. So the adoption rates, right? And you also discover that existing explanations provide limited understanding of the underlying institutional factors, underlying cultural factors, underlying social mechanisms. These could also be social mechanisms, but they're not necessarily factors. Underlying social mechanisms, underlying cultural mechanisms, right? So there is limited understanding of the underlying social, right, cultural and problem institutional mechanisms that generate these differences, right, that you want to understand, explain. So in this case, you are going to use critical realism, right? Because it's the only method that is going to unearth, if I go take you back to the to this slide, because under Basker's critical realism perspective, the empirical means a lot, the actual means a lot, and the real domain, right? And this is the real substance that gives us critical realism, the underlying causal mechanisms that generate the observable outcomes. So if we want to understand them, then we have to deal with them, because these hidden mechanisms behind the observable patterns actually mean a lot, and we must understand what they are, ladies and gentlemen. So that is an example that we can pick that allows us to use critical realism. Let me also give you another example of corruption. And the reason why I'm using corruption most of the time is because newspapers are awash right, with the stories that talk about corruption. Remember the parliament issue, the Speaker of Parliament. So many other people were also linked to the same, right? And these are not isolated cases. They've been around for years and years and years. And you remember even some of the statements that were made by His Excellency the President. I mean, the speeches are on the internet if you want. When the president made a comment that people condemn corruption, and he said, "Well, I also strongly condemn corruption. It's an evil that must be uprooted from our community, from our society." But he went ahead to say, "But these people who are very corrupt, right? They are not necessarily bad." Because after getting this money, they invest it back in the economy. Then the corruption will create what we call the billiard ball principle, if you're very familiar with that concept, so that it will trigger off, right, what we call the simultaneous internal economic kind of relationships or causal relationships, just like the way the billiard ball does. Once you hit one ball, right, it also hits the other, moves around, and then you have in all directions, and you have this kind of thing. So in other words, the fellow will set up a factory, the fellow will offer jobs to our unemployed people. Uganda Revenue Authority will tax these individuals plus the company. Government will pick the money, and in others, there will be the net effect of what you call economic growth and economic development at the end of the day. And of course, that is consistent with the utilitarian perspective. For some of you who are very familiar with utilitarianism, right? But I do not want to take you into that direction. I just wanted to show you that corruption, right, might be an example that I'm overusing here because of what is happening. So, in other words, you will discover that despite the anti-corruption legislation, right, and we have so many laws, regulations, right, corruption remains pervasive in public institutions, starting with the legislators, for example, parliament, right? You go to state-owned institutions. The private sector is also corrupt, right? You find the fellows corrupting the public sector. And in many cases, sometimes I hear people making very sarcastic statements, right? There's someone who posted something, I think, on YouTube somewhere, and I think about a child being asked, what is the major cash crop of Uganda? And he said, well, corruption is the major cash crop, right? Of course, all those things are there, right? They are being mentioned. But what I'm saying that despite the existence of laws, regulations, legislations in this case, corruption remains pervasive in public institutions. And of course, you discover, especially when you go out and start reviewing the literature, you discover that existing research inadequately explains the mechanisms through which, for example, organizational culture, informal networks, and institutional norms sustain corrupt practices, because it is actually the culture within these institutions or in the public sector and also in the private sector that actually sustain corrupt practices, and also institutional norms, right, and informal networks, right. These networks are actually sophisticated. If you look at one of the papers that I published using a phenomenological perspective some time back, and this was within the procurement officers in Uganda, right? I talk about networks. And to me, this came up as a surprising finding, actually. I did not imagine that these networks exist, but they're there and very, very powerful, by the way, very powerful. And sometimes when you get into these networks, you can even lose your life, by the way, right? It's not as easy as you think. So that's an example rooted in corruption that can actually warrant what we call the critical realist perspective, so that you go into these underlying mechanisms, right, through which corruption thrives, ladies and gentlemen. Right. So allow me to stop here and again pause a little bit because but anyway, before I pause, right, let me bring in the issue of retroduction, because retroduction is actually closely, or largely, not even closely, but largely associated with the critical realism perspective, right? And unless we understand, right, what retroduction is, it becomes very difficult for us to employ critical realism. So that's why if you see people employing critical realism, always ask them, right, how they utilized, right, what we call retroduction, right? So critical realism, ladies and gentlemen, as I introduced it, relies entirely and frequently employs what we call retroduction. So here researchers ask questions like, what mechanism must exist, right, for these observed outcomes to occur, right? So in other words, these mechanisms, as you can see on the slide, must exist for observed outcomes to occur. And this is an assumption you make, and this is a realistic assumption, right, on which critical realism is built. So the mechanism must be unearthed by your study, right? And that's why we dwell a lot on mechanism, ladies and gentlemen. So this retroductive logic, right, of mechanism distinguishes what we call critical realism, right, from other paradigms that we've been talking about, right? And some of you were asking me that, with the mixed methods, you can have so many approaches or paradigms of mixed methods. But one of the paradigms you'll find is Basker's critical realism. So unless you have retroduction, right, you cannot talk about critical realism, ladies and gentlemen. So of course the strength, right, upon which critical realism is built, right, is that you will be able to explain causality, but causality will be explained more deeply, right? So you go into depth, right, because you want to understand this phenomenon very well. So depth means a lot. But of course, the other issue is complexity, right? Reality is complex, right? And you want to unearth, right, the complex mechanisms that underlie these events and outcomes, so that which bring out the outcomes in this case. So the mechanisms are very important, that the mechanism must give you the outcomes, but we cannot understand the outcomes only the way we do in positivistic thinking, right? We predict, right, using the variables that we have either picked from theories or the ones we picked from empirical literature into a conceptual framework. And so here we want to understand and unearth them using critical realism. And that's why you have now mixed, right, methods coming in here, but largely rooted in Basker, because you can have mixed methods rooted in another philosophical orientation. Of course, the limitation here is that you may want to establish those causal mechanisms and fail, right? And that's a limitation, right? So now that the mechanism may be very difficult to identify directly, right? And if you find difficulties of picking all those mechanisms, then that's a limitation of critical realism, ladies and gentlemen, right? So of course, the implication here is that your methodology that you use must be rigorous. So under critical realism, we expect you to use rigorous methodology. Now that's why we spend too much time, right, talking about these aspects, ladies and gentlemen, right? So I'll not go into details of critical realism, right? I gave you the ontological assumptions, right? I think I gave you also epistemological assumptions, right? Maybe I could give you an example, right, to bring out this perspective, right? But I think I gave you some examples at some stage, right? So I don't have to, because I remember I used an example of digital, right, technologies, right, and so forth. So I don't have to. I think those were very simple examples, ladies and gentlemen. Right. So maybe now we move into some bit of, let me just give you a conclusive statement. We conclude, and then we now look at those specific aspects, right, that will constitute, right, a research problem, ladies and gentlemen, right. So as I conclude, right, just allow me to share slides and so that we relate these problems to, and maybe within the next 10, 20 minutes, by the way, I should be able to land. Oh, sorry, what have I done? I'm supposed to share. Where is the sharing button? Oh, sorry. Right. You will excuse me. I keep on losing a few things here and there. Right. Where are the slides? Okay, this is the slide. I thought I'd shared the slides, right? So, and I'll not go very far into this, right? So I wanted to, first of all, conclude where about the paradigms, so that we go into the research program and the history of scientific progress, looking at Kuhn. How does Kuhn, for example, inform the research program? What we've just gone through are paradigms. So later on, you'll see that within the research program, you'll have the paradigms. And of course, you also have some of these perspectives that come from Kuhn, that is the structure of scientific revolution, and also Karl Popper, right, who talks about conjectures and refutations. Of course, you know where, I mean, the contributions he made to the positivism, right, where, of course, where we have logical positivism. I know that question has not been answered yet, right? Now, maybe, ladies and gentlemen, in a conclusive way, we can say that the philosophical foundations that I've been talking about, right, of the research problems determine what researchers regard as legitimate knowledge, what researchers regard as meaningful questions, and what researchers regard as probably appropriate evidence and valuable contribution that we are going to make to the available body of knowledge. So you discover that the positivists, as I've already indicated, formulate problems around unexplained relationships and incomplete causal knowledge, while the interpretivists will actually formulate problems around inadequate understanding of meanings and lived experiences. While the critical realists, right, on the other hand, ladies and gentlemen, will formulate problems around hidden mechanisms, right, and of course, those mechanisms that generate observable outcomes, as we have already seen, ladies and gentlemen. So, of course, critical theorists in this case, right, formulate problems around many things, right, that you hear the opponent and probably the examiners ask students, like the hidden, for example, power structures, right, issues of inequality, issues of domination, issues of exclusion, and things like that. And that's why the research program that you are going to formulate, ladies and gentlemen, must, in one way or the other, carefully reflect, right, on the philosophical assumptions, right, because these assumptions influence a number of things, the nature of the research program, influences the way you are going to formulate the problem, depending on the nature of the problem and the contribution that you're going to make to the available fund of knowledge. And your contribution certainly depends on this. Right, so let me pause a little bit before I introduce this and then stop, right? Because I know we've taken a long time in this lecture and many people are very, very tired, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, let me give you the floor to make a comment, one or two, and then I introduce the slide and I stop right at the introduction. Right, can you unmute and speak, whoever wants to speak, or if you have a question, please ask that question.
Good evening, Prof.
Good evening, Ntale Rashid.
Prof, there is something that is bothering me regarding the paradigms, especially the one on critical realism. Under positivism, you said that the researcher is independent of the research, of the study. Whereas under interpretism,
that is the assumption. That is the assumption. But which is actually dismissed by Roy Basker.
And you said under interpretism is interdependent of the research. So I'm wondering, under critical realism, where is the position of the research?
I gave you the position of the under critical realism, right? In the sense that both of them, whether you are positivistic, right, or the interpretivist, reality still exists, and that reality is hidden, right? And there are also underlying causal mechanisms that actually generate the outcomes that we observe. Meaning that now under critical realism, you must actually combine the two, right, in one or the other. And that's why you use actually mixed methods.
Okay.
Thank you, Prof. Now, the difference between mixed methods here for Roy Basker and the others is that here we look at the underlying mechanisms. And therefore, even the methodologies you employ must be rigorous enough to bring out those underlying mechanisms, right? Otherwise, if you are unable to bring out the underlying mechanisms, then you don't know what you are talking about. You are no longer talking about Roy Basker's critical realism, philosophical orientational paradigm.
Yes.
Right. Any other comments?
Thank you, Prof. Understood.
Good evening, Prof. and colleagues.
Yes, Rose. Good evening.
Yes, Prof. Please help me to throw more light on the difference between critical realism and pragmatism. I'm getting a little bit confused.
Pragmatism. Why don't we wait a bit and I introduce this, then I answer your question. Please write it down.
Thank you, Prof.
Write it down, the difference between pragmatism, because pragmatism again uses mixed methods. Maybe it is at this point that I should actually differentiate the two. Otherwise, you might go with them sort of confused perspective. Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce the research problem and the history.
Yes, Prof, I have my hand up. This is George Passy.
Please.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor, for the clarity you've given. Still asking about the critical realism paradigm. Is it always a must that it should be a mixed method? Can we have a multi-method quantitative approach to this?
Quantitative, no, you will not bring out the other hidden mechanisms. It's very hard. Very, very hard. I'm not aware of the positivistic multi-methods that brings it out. Do you have one that I may not have thought about?
Yes, I think there's a paper by Koopman, I think 2013. And it's about, because my school is CHS. It's work I'm doing on sickle cell disease. I'm applying the main phenomenon here is under recognition of sickle cell disease in Uganda.
Yeah.
Despite policy shifts in trying to ramp up testing. And I'm applying a theory of the syndemic, because both malaria and sickle cell disease are interlinked.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to see mechanisms along a pathway that leads to sickle cell disease being visible or appearing in the health system. So I'd come up with...
You are using the experiments, huh?
Yes, syndemic theory. That is, I think, a 3-part.
Actually, you are right. You are right, because Basker, right? Basker actually emphasizes experimentation as one of the ways of discovering the hidden mechanisms, right? So in the purely scientific or natural sciences, yes, I think you can have multi-methods within the same paradigm. It's something I hadn't thought about seriously, because I'm very used to the mixed methods, the qual and quant. But in natural sciences, yes, Basker actually he has written a complete book on that experiment,
yes,
right? And that's why sometimes when students actually present in the social sciences, when they present their work, and they claim to have used critical realism, right? But you see that the mixing, that is the quant and the qualitative, is a little bit mechanical in nature. Then someone will say, did you really use, right, critical realism by Basker? Are you sure you did that? And then the other question that may follow is, and there are other tools that you should have used, right? Did you have to use qualitative, for example, in this case? Why didn't you think about other tools, right, that you can use to pick the hidden mechanisms? So unless you pick, right, the hidden mechanism, then you cannot claim to have used critical realism. So you're actually very, very, very right. Only that I was actually largely thinking about the social sciences and paying little attention to the natural sciences. So you are right. Experiments. Basker talks about experiments. Right. Another comment or question? All right. So let me just introduce this, and maybe when we get time, we shall go through this. I don't know when. Again, we haven't gone through, we haven't picked those major aspects that constitute the research problem. So hopefully, I think you can see that there's a lot. So even when you talk about the statement of the problem, it's not as easy as you think, right? So that's why even when you think you've done the best and you have generated a research problem, someone will interrogate your research problem. And let me tell you one thing, ladies and gentlemen. The moment the opponent says that you do not have a research problem, or the examiner or examiners say that you don't have a research problem, you will be in trouble. Why will you be in trouble? It's because, first of all, the philosophy you applied is wrong. Well, because you don't have a problem. Two, the theories you applied them in error. The methodologies, right, don't capture the problem. So you have failed to capture the problem. So if the examiners want, right, to pull a PhD away from you, they can do it here. They will say that you don't have a statement of the problem, therefore you do not deserve a PhD. But if you find a panel that is parental, they will say, no, the fellow can still go through his introduction, what he wrote down, right, and the literature that he has generated, and reconstruct the statement of the problem. Because the statement of the problem, first of all, will give you the objectives. The objectives will give you the hypothesis. The hypothesis will give you maybe research questions, or the objective will give you the research questions, vice versa, if you have a mixed methods. So if you don't have the problem, then you don't have the purpose of the study. It's not there. In other words, it is wrong. You don't have the objectives. So all the tests you carried out, the conceptualization, is wrong. So you must spend some good time, right, writing this statement of the problem, even when you fail to construct the background very well. At least you'd rather fail to come up with a proper background, but come up with a very nice research problem, right? So that it guides the other parts, because the other parts will be okay once the problem, you get it right. And you can always work backwards and get the introduction right, get the background correctly, because even the statement of the problem, by the way, has a background. So you must provide a very small background. If you have written a lot in the background to the study, then here you always state the problem. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think you can see the research problem has a bearing on the history of scientific progress, ladies and gentlemen, right? So, as I said, I'm going to give you an introduction of this, right? And of course, the objective here, as you can see, is, if I could just give you the objective of this session that I've just started, but I'll not go very far, is to understand Popper. That's Karl Popper. We have already gone through Karl Popper, meaning that I will not say much. Only that I will introduce Kuhn and lactose. I think I talked about lactose at some stage, who talks about scientific programs, research scientific programs, and Loudon. Of course, all these ideas here help us to formulate stronger doctoral research problems. Right. Of course, we have reasons why we study scientific progress in this case. So, ladies and gentlemen, allow me just to say something, and I stop at the slide, right? The reason why I'm taking you into this direction is to try and help you understand the development of scholarly research problems, right? And of course, doctoral students here need to appreciate how scientific knowledge advances, right? How we probably have moved, right, through these Popper, Kuhn, lactose, and Loudon, as you can see in this case. And of course, the research problems that we experience do not occur randomly, ladies and gentlemen, but they emerge from tensions, right, that seem to exist within literature. They arise from puzzles that need to be fixed. And that's why when you make a presentation, the examiners will ask you a question: what are the underlying tensions that you are trying to deal with? What are the puzzles that you're trying to deal with? What are the contradictions, right, that you are dealing with? What are the anomalies? What are the unresolved questions or conceptual weaknesses, and probably failures in terms of the existing explanations? So these questions will come up at a time when you have made your presentation, right, from the background, the statement of the problem, up to the end with your results. Someone will take you back to the statement of the problem when they begin asking for the tensions, for the puzzles, for the contradictions, for the anomalies. So they are actually interrogating your statement of the problem without knowing. And even if you have this information in the background of the study, ladies and gentlemen, and you have clearly articulated these aspects, as long as the statement of the problem does not introduce these tensions, it does not introduce these what we call the contradictions, right, or probably, I mean, these aspects that create intellectual advances in knowledge, right? So if these are not presented, then we are in trouble. And that's why we look at the history and the philosophy of science that actually show major intellectual advances and how these have occurred over time when researchers confronted or attempted to confront knowledge, right, and try to explain and create and manufacture knowledge. You remember last time when I made that statement about knowledge creation, there's a student who comes from the natural sciences who said, Well, for us, we are not really bothered with that, as long as the parasite that we are examining has economic value. That's all we consider. So, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, a doctoral problem should not be understood merely as something not yet studied. So you do not simply make a statement and say, but this one has not been studied. This one was studied in Europe, but has not been studied in Uganda. This has been done this other way, but we need to find another way of dealing with this kind of thing. Right, so you can say that our concern is the tension in the literature, the unresolved tensions, the puzzles, right, that we need to understand. So do not bring up your statements where you say this is not yet studied, right, and therefore we need to study it in this case. So in other words, the problem, right, in this case should be understood as intellectually significant, right? That intellectually significant problem or difficulty, right, within existing body of knowledge. And that means that we must interrogate literature, ladies and gentlemen. So when your supervisor says, go and review literature, that is what they mean. Because they know that the difficulty that they are talking about may actually arise because theory, right, fails to explain observed reality, right? And that's a tension that exists within literature. Or you discover that dominant paradigms no longer accommodate, right, emerging evidence, right? So you have evidence that is emerging, but the existing paradigms, unfortunately, cannot explain these results that are coming up. So meaning that the dominant paradigm must be revisited, right? Meaning that we need to seek explanations in this case, ladies and gentlemen. So of course, this becomes very important, and that's why we have to go back to Kuhn, we have to go back to lactose, we have to go back to Popper, right, Karl Popper, and we've been discussing the works of Karl Popper. So as you can see here, the works of Karl Popper, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see from the slide here, and Thomas Kuhn, and Imre Lactose, and of course Larry Loudon are especially useful in doctoral studies, as we have already seen, because they explain how knowledge, of course, developed through problem identification, through criticism, through the unresolved tensions that I've been talking about here, the theoretical competition, you have competing explanations, right? And of course, problem solving, if you are concerned with the generation of a model, right, that must actually be adopted in this kind of setting to explain what is happening. Just like this morning, the student who presented in the area of agriculture, the concern was actually developing a model, only that he was using a wrong paradigm to generate a model, right? Because you cannot generate a model from those philosophical orientation that the student was actually trying to use. So allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to stop here, right? So that next time when we meet, we examine, right, the works of these people in detail, right? Like Karl Popper, and we shall be looking at Karl Popper and the research problem as the engine of science, right, at that material time when we get there. So I think with that, let me stop there. And if you have the question, then you can answer the question that you have, right? So you can unmute and speak, and then we shall stop there, maybe in the next 5-10 minutes, right? Anyone?
Prof. Musa Modoy here. Mine is a procedure issue.
what?
How do I enlist?
Hello?
Mine is a procedure issue.
Hello?
Prof, can you hear me?
I'm
Yes,
not
please. I can hear you.
I'm not getting you well. Okay. You can speak now.
Okay. Mine is a procedure issue. How do I get enlisted? I don't know if it's a WhatsApp group or a mail group where I don't have to rely on a third party to learn about, the sessions, because they're very informative, and somehow I would love to hook in as soon as they start than wait when someone just says, oh, by the way, there's this going on. But I really appreciate your intellectual enrichment. I thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we sent you a link to join, but unfortunately, maybe you didn't see it. Mtale, can you get in touch with that gentleman? And I don't know, did I make you an administrator of our platform? Oh, Mtale.
Actually, no.
But I posted this on the Makerere.
No.
I posted it on Makerere webpage.
Yes, Prof, whenever you share, I also share to those other groups that don't, we do not subscribe to.
I think I also sent to those groups of Makerere. The one who asked the question, aren't you on Makerere groups?
No, I'm not. I'm only on the School of Law group. And during the 2-week session, I requested to be enrolled, but I think the administrators were busy. It has not happened.
So can you send information to Ntale? We shall see how to include you on our platform.
Yes, right away, sir.
Okay, Ntale pick his contact. All right. Now I think
I'm taking it in my mind.
Okay. Let me just answer the question that was asked by Ruth. I think I still remember the question. It was about pragmatism and critical realism. Again, in brief, without spending too much time, people are tired. Ruth, pragmatism and critical realism are both useful philosophical positions in doctoral research, especially for mixed methods and of course applied social research, right? So they both use mixed methods, it is true. However, they differ in their assumptions about reality, their assumptions about knowledge, their assumptions about causality, and the purpose of research. For example, pragmatism asks what works in solving the research problem, right? In other words, once you have articulated the reality and you have identified the research problem, so your objective is in solving that problem, right? That research problem. So you must come up with the actionable solutions, right? And of course, you must identify what works, right, in solving that research problem. But critical realism will ask what hidden mechanisms, right? And I think I've spent too much time talking about the hidden mechanisms that generate the observed problem. So pragmatism, as you can see, is primarily problem solving. So if your interest is problem solving, right, you want to come up with a solution, and that is very true for the other gentleman who was looking at parasites, I think he was talking about fishing hatchery, if you remember, fish hatcheries. All right, it's problem solving, right? Even those fellows who are in the area of the medical, medical discipline, right? Right. So they might be interested in the actual problems, engineering and things like that. So in other words, pragmatism will be used handy at that particular stage because you want to get a solution to a particular problem that exists out there, right? And it is actually consequence oriented, as you can see. But critical realism is primarily mechanism seeking and explanatory. You want to explain what is happening, and you want to get those hidden mechanisms that actually explain the outcome, the other side. So I think, again, Ruth, you need to be aware of the fact that the person behind the pragmatism is Charles Sanders and William James and John Dewey. And of course, later on, when they bring in the mixed methods, you have the mixed methods scholars like Tasha Corey and Tedley. And of course, you have Crosswell. I sent you that book, and Plano Clark. If you have read them, then you know what pragmatism is all about. So, of course, pragmatism will assume that knowledge should be judged by its practical consequences. Right. So during the vivas, when you hear the examiners and the other fellows asking questions like, what are the practical and actionable? So they are coming from a pragmatism perspective or philosophical orientation. So the practical consequences are very important in this case. So a pragmatic researcher will be less concerned with the defending, right, one fixed philosophical position, right, and will be more concerned with the choosing methods that best answer the research question. So they will not really want to go very much into philosophical positions and tackle them, but the fellow will be able to give you methods at every stage, right? That I'm mixing this, I'm mixing it with the other, because I know the weaknesses of this is probably solved by the strength that this one brings on board and things like that. But the fellow, I mean, will use the pragmatic, right, perspectives at every stage. That at this level, let us try to adapt it because it's what works, it's what creates the solution to this particular problem. So I think in this case, the pragmatists then, right, will ask, what is the research problem? What methods will best answer this question? What evidence is useful? What findings can help solve the problem? And what practical consequences follow from the study? So those are some of the issues that will come up. But again, since we have started dealing with the issue of the problems, we shall again look at the problem. How do we construct the research problem under pragmatism, pragmatist philosophical orientation? So, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, it is very hard for us to exhaust all the philosophical paradigms and orientations, right? We can only cover a few here and there, but each one of them has implications on the kind of problem that is dealt with. Right. So I think we can stop there. Is there any reason as to why you think we should not?
Thank you so much, Prof.
Yes? Okay. Right, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much. I've benefited the personal.
Let's agree to stop here and then we shall start from there next time. But Rashid picked the number for that gentleman. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It was nice having you this evening, and let's meet next time. Right. Bye. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Prof.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor.
It was wonderful.